When my grandfather passed, my family was stunned to learn he left his entire $2.8 million estate to me. My dad screamed, "That was meant for your sister." That night, they held me down and shredded the will in front of me. I just smiled, because what they destroyed was actually a duplicate. Grandpa made sure I'd always be 10 steps ahead. I, 24M, never expected my grandfather's death to tear my family apart. But that's exactly what happened the moment his lawyer read the will. The old man had always been sharp as a tack, running his construction business until the day he passed, but nobody anticipated what he'd done with his fortune. The lawyer's office felt suffocating as we all sat in those uncomfortable leather chairs. My parents, my sister, a few aunts and uncles, all waiting to hear how Grandpa's $2.8 million estate would be divided. I figured maybe I'd get a small token, perhaps his old tools or the truck he taught me to drive in. My sister had always been the golden child, the one who visited every Sunday, who brought him his favorite cookies. The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading. Property, investments, bank accounts, everything was going to one person. Me. The room went dead silent, then erupted into chaos. My father's face turned purple as he screamed that this was impossible, that everything was meant for my sister. My mother was crying, demanding to see the document. My sister just sat there in shock, staring at me like I'd personally robbed her. But I was just as stunned as everyone else. Grandpa and I had been close, sure, but this was beyond anything I could have imagined. We'd spent countless hours in his workshop, him teaching me carpentry and sharing stories about building the business from nothing. He'd always said I reminded him of himself at my age, but I never thought it meant anything like this. The chaos followed us home. My parents cornered me in the living room, demanding explanations I didn't have. My father kept shouting about how unfair this was, how my sister deserved the money more than I did. She'd been the one taking care of Grandpa's medical appointments, they argued, the one who'd sacrificed her social life to spend time with him. I tried explaining that I never asked for any of this, that I was as surprised as anyone, but they weren't listening. My sister finally spoke up, her voice cold and calculated. She said Grandpa must have been manipulated in his final years, that maybe his mind wasn't as sharp as we thought. She suggested we contest the will, fight it in court. The way she looked at me made my skin crawl, like I was some kind of con artist who'd tricked a dying old man. That night, they made their move. I was in my childhood bedroom, trying to process everything that had happened, when my door burst open. My parents rushed in with my sister right behind them. Before I could react, they had me pinned to the bed. My father was stronger than I remembered, and my mother held my arms while my sister went for the will I'd foolishly left on my desk. I watched in horror as she tore it to pieces, her face twisted with satisfaction. She said this would fix everything, that now the estate would go to probate and be divided fairly. My parents were nodding along, convinced they were doing the right thing. They told me this was for the family, that I'd understand someday. But I just smiled. They looked at me like I'd lost my mind, demanding to know what was so funny. I told them they might want to call Grandpa's lawyer in the morning. The confusion on their faces was priceless as I explained that what they'd just destroyed was a copy, one of several copies Grandpa had made sure existed. The real will was safely filed with the lawyer, with additional copies in his safe deposit box, and with his financial advisor. Grandpa had been in the construction business for 50 years. He knew better than anyone that important documents needed backup plans. My father's face went white as I continued. I explained how Grandpa had called me 3 months before he died, asking me to meet him at his lawyer's office. He'd seemed different that day, more serious than usual. He told me he'd been watching our family dynamics for years, paying attention to who really cared about him versus who just saw dollar signs. He'd noticed how my sister's visits increased dramatically after his first heart attack, how she suddenly became interested in his finances and started asking about his will. He'd seen how my parents began treating him differently once they realized how much money he'd accumulated over the decades. But with me, he said, conversations were always about work, about life, about everything except money. That day in the lawyer's office, he'd made his intentions clear. He wanted his legacy to go to someone who'd actually preserve it, someone who understood the value of hard work. He told me about all the safeguards he was putting in place, including multiple copies of the will and detailed documentation of his mental state at the time of signing. The next morning brought exactly what I expected. My family was frantically calling the lawyer, trying to explain what had happened. The lawyer calmly informed them that destroying a copy of a will doesn't invalidate the original, and that Grandpa had specifically anticipated this possibility. He'd even included a clause about what would happen if anyone attempted to interfere with the execution of his wishes. My parents were devastated, but my sister's reaction was something else entirely. She accused me of manipulating Grandpa, of poisoning his mind against the family. She threatened to take me to court to prove that the will was invalid. I almost felt sorry for her until I remembered how quickly she'd turned violent the night before. The lawyer scheduled a meeting to discuss the estate transfer. My family demanded to be present, still hoping they could find some loophole or challenge the will's validity. What they discovered instead was how thoroughly Grandpa had planned everything. He'd included detailed letters explaining his reasoning, complete with specific examples of behavior that had influenced his decision. He wrote about overhearing my sister discussing his assets with her friends, treating his money like it was already hers. He mentioned my parents' sudden interest in his healthcare decisions once they realized he might need expensive treatments. But the most damaging evidence was a series of recordings. Grandpa had started recording family conversations after his first heart attack, initially just wanting to remember visits in case his memory started failing. What he captured instead was months of my family discussing his estate like he was already dead. In one particularly damning recording, my sister could be heard calculating how much money she'd inherit and discussing plans to sell his house immediately. My parents were heard agreeing that the construction business should be liquidated quickly for cash. None of them seemed to consider that he might have wanted his life's work preserved. The recordings were devastating. My family sat in stunned silence as months of their private conversations played back. Their lawyer, yes, they'd hired one by this point, could only shake his head. There was no arguing with evidence this comprehensive. But Grandpa's planning went even deeper. He'd also included provisions for what would happen if anyone contested the will. Any family member who challenged his wishes would forfeit their right to even the small bequests he'd left them. My parents had been set to receive $50,000 each, and my sister was supposed to get his jewelry collection. By destroying what they thought was the will, they'd triggered this clause. The irony was perfect. In trying to steal my inheritance, they'd lost their own. The estate transfer took several weeks to complete, during which my family went through various stages of grief and anger. My sister tried everything from guilt trips to threats, insisting that I should share the inheritance regardless of what the will said. My parents alternated between begging and demanding, unable to accept that their actions had consequences. I felt sorry for them, I really did, but I also understood why Grandpa had done this. He'd built his fortune through careful planning and hard work, and he wanted it to go to someone who would respect that legacy. The fact that my family's first instinct was to destroy what they thought was his final wishes proved his point perfectly. Update 1. 3 months later, I was settling into my new reality as the inheritor of a substantial fortune. The money was overwhelming at first, but Grandpa had included detailed instructions about managing the inheritance. He'd even arranged for his financial advisor to help me navigate the transition. My family had gone quiet for a while, but that didn't last. My sister showed up at my apartment one evening, tears in her eyes, claiming she'd been wrong and asking for forgiveness. She said the stress had made her act irrationally, that she never meant to hurt me. For a moment, I almost believed her sincerity. Then she started talking about her student loans, her credit card debt, how difficult things had been financially. She never directly asked for money, but the implication was clear. She wanted me to bail her out of her financial problems, to essentially give her the inheritance she felt she deserved. I told her I needed time to think about it, and she left seeming hopeful. But something about the conversation felt rehearsed, too calculated. I decided to test my suspicions by mentioning to my parents that my sister had visited and seemed genuinely remorseful. The trap worked perfectly. Within days, my parents were calling to tell me how proud they were that my sister had apologized, how this could be a chance for our family to heal. They suggested that helping her financially would be a good first step toward reconciliation. The coordination was obvious. They'd planned this approach together. But I'd learned from Grandpa's example about being thorough. I'd been recording our conversations since the will reading, just in case. When I played back my sister's apology, the manipulation was clear. She'd hit every emotional note perfectly, from remorse to subtle guilt tripping to the carefully planted financial sob story. Update 2. The final revelation came 6 months after Grandpa's death, when I was going through his personal papers at the house I'd inherited. Hidden in his desk was a journal he'd kept during his final year, detailing not just his thoughts about the family, but specific incidents that had shaped his decision. The entries were heartbreaking. He wrote about feeling used and discarded, about realizing that some family members only contacted him when they needed something. He'd documented every interaction, every conversation, building a case for his final decision. But the most shocking entry was dated just 2 weeks before he died. He'd overheard my sister on the phone, talking to someone about handling the old man and making sure she got what was rightfully hers. She'd actually been planning to contest the will even before he died, assuming he'd leave everything to her. My parents weren't innocent either. The journal revealed they'd been encouraging my sister's sense of entitlement, discussing how to manage Grandpa's finances once he became incapacitated. They'd seen his age as an opportunity, not understanding that his mind remained sharp until the very end. Reading those entries, I finally understood the depth of his disappointment and the wisdom behind his choices. He hadn't just been protecting his money. He'd been protecting his values, ensuring they'd continue through someone who actually shared them. The journal also contained instructions I hadn't found in the official will. He wanted me to use part of the inheritance to expand the construction business, to honor the workers who'd helped build his success. He'd left detailed plans for employee profit sharing and benefits improvements that would ensure his legacy lived on through the people who'd worked beside him. Update 3. A year later, I'd implemented most of Grandpa's final wishes. The construction business was thriving under new management, with improved worker benefits and a profit-sharing program that would have made him proud. I'd also established a scholarship fund in his name for students pursuing trades and construction management. My family had finally accepted reality, though our relationships remained strained. My sister had moved across the country, cutting contact with everyone. My parents still reached out occasionally, but our conversations were awkward and superficial. They'd lost more than money. They'd lost the respect and trust that held our family together. But I'd gained something invaluable, an understanding of what real family means. Grandpa had shown me that love isn't about blood relations or expectations. It's about mutual respect, shared values, and genuine care for each other's well-being. The family members who'd truly mourned his passing weren't the ones who'd felt entitled to his money. I kept one of his journal entries framed on my desk, a reminder of the lesson he'd taught me. A man's true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the principles he passes on and the people who choose to honor them. The inheritance had been a test, and my family had failed spectacularly. But in their failure, they'd revealed their true nature, allowing me to make informed decisions about who deserved my trust and loyalty going forward. Sometimes I wondered if Grandpa had known exactly how everything would play out. Given his meticulous planning in every other aspect of his life, I suspected he'd anticipated their reactions perfectly. His final gift wasn't just money. It was clarity about who my real family truly was. The people who mattered most weren't the ones who'd felt entitled to his fortune, but the workers who'd respected him, the neighbors who'd genuinely cared about his well-being, and the few family members who'd mourned his loss rather than celebrating their expected inheritance. In the end, Grandpa had given me more than financial security. He'd given me the wisdom to recognize true character, the strength to stand up for what's right, and the understanding that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior. His legacy lived on, not just in the money he'd left behind, but in the values he'd instilled and the lessons he'd taught about choosing integrity over convenience, principle over popularity. Every day, I tried to honor that legacy by making decisions he would have been proud of. The inheritance had changed my life, but more importantly, it had revealed the true nature of the people around me. That knowledge, painful as it was, had been the most valuable gift of all.